Hello everyone and welcome to a game a lot of you have requested. I didn't have time to cover it since we are covering the candidates tournament, but now there's a rest today, so I decided to check it out. It's Magnus Carlsen versus Nihal Sarin. It's from, basically the match Magnus Carlsen played against everyone in the Julius Baer challenge. I don't know how many, I think against 20 participants, and we're going to discuss the standings and how he did after we check out this game. But this is the, I think the nicest one and the one that you guys requested the most, so let's check it out. Magnus has the white pieces, and he opens with e4. We have e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and the bishop to b5. Now, Magnus goes for the Ruy Lopez, and here we have a6. Morphy's defense with bishop to a4 and knight to f6 now. Attacking that e4 pawn. We have d3 defending it, and now d6 by Nihal. We have c4. Here usually you'll see c3, which prepares d4 sometimes in the distant future, but here Magnus wants to, I guess, catch Nihal, off guard and go for some sort of a it's not an offbeat line, it's a line that is being played, but maybe not that much at the absolute top level. So here he wants to surprise him. We have c4, the so-called Duras variation, and now comes g6. The center is now closed, and Nihal wants to play bishop to g7, and at some point bring this knight to d4, and the bishop will help out with that very nicely. So here we have h3, preventing development to g4, and the bishop to g7 here. We have knight to c3 by Magnus, and now Nihal castles, both Magnus castles as well. And now there is one game from 2003 where h6 was played, but here we have knight to d7, and it is now already, as of move 9, that we have a completely new game. So let's see how Magnus deals with this. He plays bishop to e3. And okay, Nihal continues with his plan, knight to d4, the knight is now on an excellent square, and of course, if you don't want to allow it to remain there, you have to capture it, which is what Magnus does. He plays bishop captures on d4, we have e captures, and now comes bishop captures on d7, and this bishop captures on d7 will come back to haunt Magnus, as you'll see. So here you have to go back with the knight, for example knight e2, then c5, and then the game continues with Black having his pawn structure a little bit messed up, but he has a lot of presence here in the center, and this is compensation enough. So instead, after e captures on d4, Magnus goes for a sort of a capture fest trade. We have bishop captures on d7, d captures on c3, bishop captures on c8, c captures on b2, now attacking the rook here, rook to b1, and rook captures on c8. And now Magnus needs to get rid of this pawn because it's extremely dangerous, so he has to play d4, break this bishop's defense of the pawn on b2, and now comes c5, attacking the center here. We have rook captures on b2 and c captures on d4. And while you could go for knight captures on d4, you don't really gain anything, just rook captures on c4 grabs another pawn. Now there's a double attack here on the knight, and after rook d2, let's say rook queen to e7, the game continues, where Nihal would still be up a pawn and would retain a better position. So instead, after c captures on d4, Magnus tries rook captures on b7, we have rook captures on c4, and now comes queen to b3, attacking the rook here, but this will not do. Here, Nihal goes rook to c3, now attacks the queen here, and Magnus now plays queen to a4, and this is now extremely dangerous. Queen to b6 was a bit more resilient, but believe it or not, the game is lost now. So feel free to pause the video and try to find the winning idea for Nihal here while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting the mating attack. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it's rook captures on f3. That's the stuff. And now we understand why the queen was a little bit better. Maybe on b6, if you already went for this line, maybe you could force a trade. But now you have to capture back. So g captures on f3 was played. Now comes queen to g5 with check. King to h1, and now comes queen to f4. A little bit more precise, but these are blitz games, so a bit more precise than queen to f4 maybe would have been bishop to e5, because it kind of prevents the king from reaching the g2 square. And now you're going to prepare queen f4 to queen to h2 checkmate, and if rook to g1 attacking the queen, queen f4 now, threatening checkmate, and if rook to g3, blocking this, now you go, not that, now you go rook to c8, threatening rook to c1, and only after, for example, rook to b1, you're gonna play d3, d2, and it's gonna be a very, very easy victory for Sarin. So here instead, after king to h1, queen to f4 was played, a bit of a different move order, but it helps Magnus defend. King to g2 now, right away. And now if you continue with bishop to e5, rook to h1, and this is actually quite resilient. So instead, after king to g2, we have queen back to g5 with check. Magnus repeats, king h1, queen f4, king to g2, and now bishop to e5. Nonetheless, he has to go for it. There is nothing better. And now comes rook to d1 by Magnus. Again, rook to h1 is the way to go here. Even though it looks very odd, what are you going to do with the rook there? And I mean, it's a pretty bad position for white. Problem is, for example, if queen to g5 check, king to f1, yes, it does seem that your king is stuck in the center, the rook is stuck here on h1, but after something like rook to c8, you will play this h4 move, and this is the problem. If rook to c1 check, you can always go to e2, it's not a problem, and well, not much else to be done here. If queen to f4, king to g2, and we return to this position where the rook is guarding the h2 square, but now black no longer has access to the g5 square. So this was a little bit better. Magnus goes for rook to d1, and now comes rook to c8. And now it's a bit different. We have queen to d7 by Magnus attacking the rook and putting pressure on f7, but it is defended by the black queen. And now rook to c2, bringing the rook into the attack, even though black here has a forced checkmate in 8, so I'm just going to show it because it's very nice. Queen to h2 check, king to f1, queen h1 check, king to e2, now rook to c2 with check, rook to d2 blocking, and now this d3 check idea, point being that now you don't really have many options here. King captures on d3, now rook back to c3 check, you can't go anywhere up the board, you have to go down the board. So king e2, queen captures on f3 check, king to f1, rook c1 check, and now after the rook blocks, you can play rook captures on c1 checkmate. So it's quite a nice one, but doesn't really matter. Rook to c2 was played, the position is completely winning for black, so regardless, queen to e8 check, king to g7, and now Magnus is without a move, but he did not resign here. He instead tried to play this on. Maybe he can still win on time, you never know. Queen captures on f7, queen captures, we have rook captures, wow, rook captures, king captures, and now f4. So he will still try to pose some problems. Bishop captures, rook captures, and now rook captures on a2. We have rook to c4, and now comes bishop to e3, putting pressure on the f2 pawn. We have king f3, now bishop to c5, and not much for white to do here. We have e5, trying to get rid of the defender of the bishop, but just rook captures on f2 now. This comes with check, king g3, we have king to e6, and now e captures on d6. We have rook to f5, defending the bishop, and now rook to a4, going after this pawn here. Bishop captures on d6, and now we have king to g2. We have a5, advancing that pawn here. Instead of this, yeah, you can't really get the king to a better square, so king g2, we have a5, and now rook to e4 with check. We have rook to e5 blocking, and now rook to h4, going after the pawn here. But now bishop to b4, and there's not all that much you can do here. Magnus grabs the pawn, there's nothing better, but now a4. We have rook to b7, attacking the bishop, just bishop d6, rook to a7, getting the rook behind the passed pawn, and while all of these are principled moves, you are still down a piece, so there's always that. So here we have a3, king to f3, we have rook to e3 with check, a nice crushing blow for Nihal. Nihal saying that, okay, if you don't want to resign, then we can end the game like this. But of course, Magnus did not capture. Magnus moved the king, rook to g3 with check, king to h4, and now rook back to b3. So he's still hoping to hold on for as long as possible. king to g5, and now rook captures on h3. We have king captures on g6, rook to g3 check, king h5, and now king to d5. We have king to h4 attacking the rook, rook to c3 now. King to g4, we have bishop to c5 attacking the rook, and here I think Magnus just pre-moved king f5, and here Nihal just grabbed the rook here, and it was in this position that Magnus Carlsen resigned the game. And a wonderful victory for Nihal Sarin after 52 moves. But in reality, the game was actually over on move 19 when Magnus played queen to a4, and this rook captures on f3 pretty much sealed the deal. So it kind of went the wrong way for Magnus at this point. After e captures on d4, you do not capture the bishop, so this was the slight inaccuracy that led to a better position, and then we just had this, like we said, queen to a4. This simply will not do. Maybe a little bit more resilient was queen back to d1, guarding the knight, but your position is already worse, and here, after queen to a4, Sarin simply made the absolute most out of it and won the game very nicely. So he's one of the two players that defeated Magnus in this challenge, alongside Wander Liang, and he also one person who drew against Magnus is Vincent Kaima. So there you have it, 2 losses and 1 draw, and all of the other games were won by Magnus. So Magnus against the challengers, final score 19.5 out of the 22 possible points, so not bad. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Congratulations to Nihal Sarin for such a magnificent victory against the world champion. I would like to thank Tony Carbonao, Piotr Pagovsky, Yuval Blankovsky, Sinan Telici, and Pietro Testa for contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the candidates, checking up on your wonderful suggestions, and whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.